recommend it to the House.
Honourable Annette King.
Mr Speaker, it is such a shame that the member who has resumed his seat, the Dr Paul Hutchison, never had the opportunity to become the Minister of Health, because I believe he would have made a very fine Minister of Health, because he's always stood by his principles, and you just heard some of them tonight when it comes to the control of tobacco. You know, there are some things that happen in your political career that are less than memorable. Then there are other times when you're involved in policy or change that remain with you for the rest of your life. And for 5 years I was involved as Minister of Health in the World Health Organisation's Framework Convention on tobacco control. And New Zealand, along with Australia and Norway, and for the first time the involvement of NGOs, were the driving force in getting in place a comprehensive framework on tobacco control. And at those meetings was Dr Robert Beaglehole, there supporting and encouraging and guiding, along with Dr Don Matheson and others. And at the 56th Assembly on the 21st of May 2003, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control became the first WHO treaty adopted under Article 19 of the WHO Constitution. In fact, it is one of the most quickly ratified conventions in the history of the UN. The treaty itself came into force on the 27th of February 2005, and so at my last visit to Geneva at the World Health Assembly, I was fortunate to be there to celebrate the final implementation of this historic convention. It had been signed by 168 countries and legally binding on 177 ratifying countries. And what did the treaty seek to do? It sought to protect the present and future generations from the devastating health, social, environmental and economic consequences of tobacco consumption and exposure to tobacco smoke. It also set up a universal set of standards stating the dangers of tobacco and limiting its use in forms worldwide. So it provided rules governing production, sale, distribution, advertisement, taxation on tobacco. It provided a minimum set of standards and encouraged ratifying countries to go even further. It was considered, and still is considered, a watershed moment for international public health, because it was the first multilateral binding agreement regarding a chronic non-communicable disease. Some of the requirements in that convention: the need to have public awareness, we have that in New Zealand; a demand reduction through taxation measures, we have that; a comprehensive ban on advertising, that's been in place for a long time; restriction of sale to minors, that's been in place for a long time; to have cessation programs for addiction. And of course we've had major policies in smoking cessation programs in this country for a long time. Passive smoking, an obligation to protect all people from the exposure of tobacco, indoors, workplaces, public transport. New Zealand have done those things. And a significant one was on packaging and labelling, that there be a minimum of large health warnings, a minimum of 30% of the package cover, but 50% or more was recommended. This bill meets one of those last requirements under the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And I heard some of the interjections from the Honourable John Banks. Does it work? Mr Banks, on its own, it would have to be proven. But it was put together as a framework and a package of measures, together believed by the best experts we have internationally on health, to be able to reduce the consumption of tobacco, not only the consumption but the prevalence of tobacco smoking in countries. So I urge you to see it as part of the continuation of implementation of that very, very important framework. So New Zealand has always been a leader in tobacco control. And so I have been pleased at the measures that have been taken. And Dr. Hutchison, I have no doubt of your sincerity, but I have to remind you that in the 9 years that we were in government as the 5th Labor government, go back and look at the record. Unfortunately, your government voted against every tobacco control measure we implemented. I'm quite sure that probably wasn't your choice, but that is the record. It's on the record. And I do believe that Tariana Turia, who was part of our government and was very, very aware of not only the evils of tobacco, but what was required under the convention, has continued to promote tobacco control. I commend her for that. I was disappointed when I heard her say recently Labor did nothing for tobacco control. I think it must have been a slip of the tongue, because without that convention and ratifying that convention and the legislation and the measures that followed, we would not be where we are today. I'd also like to commend the work that was done by our former leader, Helen Clark. She was totally committed to tobacco control and probably brought in the hardest measure, the first measure. It's always the hardest to bring in the first, and that was banning smoking in workplaces. And many of us who had factories in our electorates and we had working people who voted Labor were very aware of the impact when it came to the 1990 election, and some of us were made redundant for a short while. I too am very disappointed at the reaction of the big tobacco industry and business. And I agree with Phil Goff. They ought to butt out of telling New Zealand what we ought to do when it comes to public health. They have no right to dictate to New Zealand and New Zealanders what we ought to do with a product that every one of them is dangerous for a person's health. But then I have to say it's not unusual they would do that, because unfortunately the USA has not signed the Convention on Tobacco Control. They have refused to sign or to ratify it. In fact, Mr. Bush, President Bush, refused to take the treaty to the Senate. So the Senate never even got the opportunity to debate it. And here we have big tobacco companies who make their money by their product that kills people, trying to tell New Zealanders what we ought to do in terms of our own legislation. I would have to say that I am a little disappointed that we have to wait for the passage of this legislation, and we're waiting to see what happens in the Australian court case. I think good on the Australians for having the courage to say to those big tobacco companies, bring it on. And I'm glad that they've got the money to be able to fund the illegal case. Good point, Mr. Banks. He just asked why we are waiting. It's a question you need to put it to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, yes, I agree, we believe it. It's part of what we believe and where we're heading. The Prime Minister wants to wait to see what happens in the court case in Australia. I think probably the fear is that they might then take us to court. Well, I'd give them the two-finger salute and say, bring it on, because we will, as a Parliament, first of all, want to protect the health of New Zealanders. And big tobacco industry, they continue to peddle their product now into third world countries. And when you look at the countries that have not ratified the convention, and some of them haven't signed it, you will find most of them rely on the growing and the smoking of tobacco. And they prey on those people, and I say shame on them. I also was disappointed, and some of you would have seen the press release that came out from the New Zealand Association of Convenience Stores. They are opposed to this measure. And they say the Ministry of Health is hell-bent on supporting this legislation. Well, if they're listening tonight, they need to know that the majority of this Parliament is hell-bent on moving a measure that is going to add to the package of measures we have to reduce the consumption and the prevalence of tobacco in New Zealand and, as Dr Hutchison said, save hundreds and hundreds of people's lives.
Kevin Haig.
Well, thank